I never thought telling a woman no could land me in handcuffs. But that was before I met Karen Mitchell, the HOA vice president of Willowbrook Estates, and self-proclaimed queen of the community pool. See, I moved here about a year ago, trying to rebuild after losing my wife to cancer. I picked this quiet HOA neighborhood because it had everything I needed: peace, a clean slate, and the one thing that gave me the smallest sliver of joy: a perfectly maintained resort-style pool that shimmered right outside my kitchen window. I bought the corner lot on purpose, paid extra just to have that view. Every morning I would sit with my coffee, watching the water ripple under the soft morning sun. It became a kind of therapy that helped me survive the silence that followed after Sarah passed away. For months, everything was quiet. I followed every rule, kept my lawn trimmed, my trash hidden, and my mail collected on time. Then summer rolled around, and so did my sister's son Miguel, 16, full of energy, and finally old enough to travel on his own. He came to spend the summer with me, working at the local hardware store and bringing life back into this empty house. Sarah and I never had kids, so having Miguel around felt like borrowing a little piece of the future that cancer had stolen from us. One afternoon, after a long day in the heat, Miguel asked if he could cool off in the pool and invited a couple of his co-workers along. I said, of course. They were good kids, polite, respectful, the kind that call you sir without sarcasm. They swam for about an hour, just laughing, tossing a ball, and generally being the most wholesome group of teens I'd ever seen, until she arrived, Karen Mitchell, in full tennis whites, clipboard in hand, and that god-awful vanilla perfume trailing behind her like an invisible warning sign. "Excuse me," she called out loudly enough to turn every single head in the pool area. "I need to see guest passes for these individuals now. I'd been living there almost a year, and never once had I seen or heard of a guest pass policy. I told her these boys were family and friends of Miguel, my nephew, who was staying with me for the summer. Karen looked me dead in the eye, smile razor sharp, and said, "Rules are rules, Mr. Martinez. According to the HOA bylaw subsection 4, excessive guest usage defined as more than 2 guests per household per week requires pre-approval and a valid guest pass." I offered to fill out any paperwork needed right then and there. But Karen wasn't interested in solutions. She was interested in making a point. "No exceptions," she said. And just like that, she scribbled something in her clipboard and announced that pool access for Lot 47 was officially suspended pending compliance review. It felt like a public shaming. The other residents avoided eye contact. Phones came out to look busy, and my nephew and his friends just quietly gathered their towels and left. Miguel tried to act like it didn't bother him, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand why a simple swim was being turned into a crime. That night I found an official HOA notice taped to my front door. Karen's doing. In bold letters it read, "Pool access revoked for Lot 47 due to repeated violations of guest policy." It was laughable, because that was the first time anyone even told me the rule existed. At the weekly HOA meeting, Karen made a whole speech about upholding standards and enforcing bylaws. And although she never said my name, it was obvious who the speech was targeting. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. And I realized right then that Karen had decided I was her next project. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 20 years as a construction lawyer, specializing in contract disputes, fraud investigations, and regulatory compliance. And now I was retired, grieving, and frankly looking for something to do. So when she tried to paint me as a reckless rule breaker, she had no idea she was waking up a sleeping bear. The real fun started 3 days later. When 2 squad cars rolled up to my house at 6 in the morning, I opened the door in my bathrobe, coffee in hand, to find two police officers standing awkwardly on my porch. Behind them stood Karen, arms folded, wearing that same smug expression she always wore when she thought she was winning. The officers explained that a resident had reported trespassing and possible vandalism at the community pool, and that surveillance footage had shown unauthorized minors entering the area. I told them the so-called trespassers were my nephew and his two co-workers, who had permission to be there, and had left peacefully after being asked. Karen stepped in and claimed I had violated multiple community codes by giving access to non-residents who disrupted the neighborhood and refused to leave when instructed. I asked the officers if any actual crime had been committed. They looked at each other and said no, not really, but they were obligated to respond and take a statement. They left embarrassed, apologizing quietly, as Karen stood on the curb watching them go, like she had just won a major court case. That was her second mistake, weaponizing the police against me over a swimming pool violation and pretending like I wouldn't fight back. I spent the rest of that day reviewing every single document I signed when purchasing my house. Every page of the HOA bylaws, the community charter, and the governing documents from the original property development agreement. Buried on page 42 of the charter was a clause that said all HOA policies must provide reasonable accommodation for family gatherings and temporary household expansions, defined as hosting minors or relatives for seasonal visits. Miguel and his friends fell well within that definition. Not only that, but the supposed guest policy Karen referenced was a recent amendment that had not been properly ratified by the board. According to the records I pulled, the vote never reached quorum, and the notice of policy change had never been publicly posted as required by law. So technically, the rule she was citing did not exist in enforceable form. I printed everything, organized it into folders, highlighted the key sections, and scheduled a meeting with the HOA board. I even got an appointment with Jim Walsh, the HOA president, and a former high school principal, who looked permanently uncomfortable whenever Karen opened her mouth. The meeting was set for Thursday evening, the same time Karen had planned her so-called compliance hearing at her house. Again, not a legal venue for HOA business, according to the same documents I had just studied. I showed up with my folder in hand, dressed in a suit, just to make a point. Karen greeted me at the door, like she was hosting a dinner party, not a disciplinary meeting. She had snacks, PowerPoint slides, and once again that suffocating perfume filling the room. Jim Walsh sat on one end of the dining table, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. Maria Santos, the HOA treasurer, looked equally unimpressed. Karen launched into her presentation, citing property values, community standards, and integrity. I waited for her to finish, then calmly laid out every legal violation she had committed. I pointed out the unlawful location of the meeting, the invalid policy amendment, the improper notice, and most importantly, the foundational clause that protected family visits and multi-generational households. By the time I was done, Jim Walsh looked genuinely horrified. Maria started taking furious notes, and Karen had stopped smiling entirely. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You tried to publicly embarrass me, ban my family from the pool, and call the cops on my nephew over a policy that doesn't even exist, and now I'm asking the board to formally censure your actions and immediately reinstate full privileges for Lot 47. There was a long silence, and then Jim nodded. "I think we've seen enough," he said. Karen was speechless, which for her was probably a first. The board voted on the spot to restore my pool access, remove the warning from my file, and schedule an official review of all pending HOA policy changes. But the best part came 2 weeks later, when an anonymous letter landed in everyone's mailbox. detailing multiple policy violations and misconduct by the vice president herself. It included screenshots of her emails, copies of improperly authorized fines, and even a complaint filed by another resident, claiming she had harassed their teenage daughter at the pool. Turns out Karen had a pattern, and I wasn't the first target, just the first one who fought back. Within a month, she had stepped down, citing personal reasons, and her house went up for sale shortly after. I still live here, still drink my coffee every morning by the window, and every time I look out at that pool, I think about how close I came to letting her push me around like she did everyone else. But not this time. This time, the rules actually mattered.